In the quiet, pine-laced countryside of northern Minnesota, the Thompson family had carved out a life dedicated to healing creatures that others had abandoned. Among their many rescues, one stood apart. Simba, a rescued bobcat who had grown into far more than just an animal under their care. Simba wasn't just a bobcat. He was family. A wild soul who had defied the odds before, forming an unbreakable bond with Becky's son, Kian. A boy who had faced his own struggles and found strength in his feline companion. When Becky Thompson noticed the empty spot where her rescued bobcat Simba usually slept, she knew something was wrong. But nothing could have prepared her for the phone call that followed. A tragic accident, a beloved companion fighting for his life, and an impossible decision that no family should have to make. Now, as Simba lay on the brink of death, he saw Kian's tears. Then something extraordinary happened. What unfolded next would challenge everything the Thompsons thought they knew about survival, love, and the mysterious ways in which animals and humans save each other. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The first rays of dawn were just beginning to pierce through the pine trees surrounding the Thompson family's rural home in northern Minnesota when Becky Thompson noticed something wasn't right. The usual soft patting of paws that accompanied her morning coffee routine was conspicuously absent. Simba, the rescued bobcat that had become an integral part of their family over the past 3 years, was nowhere to be found. Robert, Becky called to her husband, who was preparing breakfast for their 10-year-old son, Kian. "Have you seen Simba this morning?" Robert glanced up from the stove, a flicker of concern crossing his weathered face. "Not since last night, when he was curled up with Kian. Maybe check the sunroom? You know how he loves to watch the birds at dawn." But the sunroom was empty, as was Simba's favorite perch by the living room window. A quick check of all his usual hideaways yielded nothing, and that's when Becky noticed the slightly ajar back door, the one leading to their expansive, fenced backyard that bordered the woods. "The door," she whispered, her heart beginning to race. "Robert, I think Simba got out." The Thompson family wasn't just any family with an unusual pet. They were licensed wildlife rehabilitators, specializing in predatory mammals native to the northern woods of Minnesota. For 15 years, they had nursed injured foxes, raccoons, and occasionally, more exotic animals back to health before releasing them back into the wild. But Simba had been different from the start. 3 years ago, a local forest ranger had brought them a severely malnourished bobcat kitten, no more than a few weeks old. The tiny creature's mother had been found dead nearby, likely the victim of a territorial dispute with another predator. The kitten was in critical condition, dehydrated, suffering from a respiratory infection, and with an underdeveloped right hind leg that the veterinarian determined would never fully function normally. "He's not a candidate for release," Dr. Michaels had told them. "Even with the best care, that leg will always limit his ability to hunt effectively. He'll need specialized care for life." The Thompsons had taken the challenge seriously, applying for the necessary permits to keep a non-releasable wild animal. Their experience and facilities made approval relatively straightforward, but it was Kian's immediate connection with the bobcat kitten that truly sealed Simba's place in their home. Kian Thompson had faced his own share of challenges since birth. Diagnosed with autism at age 3, he had always struggled with sensory processing issues and social interactions. At age 5, a secondary immunodeficiency diagnosis further complicated his young life, making him prone to frequent infections and requiring careful monitoring of his respiratory health. Despite these obstacles, Kian possessed a gentle, intuitive nature that seemed especially attuned to animals. When the ranger had first brought Simba home, Kian had been having one of his difficult days, overwhelmed by sensory input, He had retreated to his quiet corner in the living room, rocking gently with his headphones on. But something about the tiny mewling sound of the Bobcat kitten had pierced through his self-imposed isolation. To everyone's surprise, Kian had removed his headphones, approached the carrier, and whispered, "He's scared like me sometimes." From that moment, an extraordinary bond began to form. As Simba grew stronger under the family's specialized care, he displayed an uncanny sensitivity to Kian's needs. When Kian became overwhelmed, Simba would quietly pad into the room and lie beside him, his steady purring seeming to calm the boy. Even more remarkably, Simba developed an apparent sixth sense for Kian's physical health issues. On several occasions, the Bobcat had alerted Becky and Robert to impending breathing difficulties by pacing anxiously near Kian and making distinct vocalizations unlike his usual sounds. Now, as Becky and Robert realized Simba had somehow escaped, their concern was twofold: for the Bobcat himself, who despite his careful upbringing remained a wild animal with special needs, and for how Kian would handle the disappearance of his constant companion. "I'll go look for him," Robert said, already pulling on his boots. "You stay here with Kian. Let's try not to alarm him until we have to." But the universe had different plans. Just as Robert was preparing to head out, the phone rang. Becky answered it, her expression shifting from concern to horror as she listened to the caller. "Yes, that's our address. Yes, he belongs to us. We have all proper licensing. Oh God, is he? Yes, we'll be right there." She hung up, her face pale. That was Mrs. Hendricks from 2 miles down the road. Simba's been hit by a car near her property. She recognized him from the special tag on his collar and called us immediately. "He's alive, but she says it looks bad." The next few moments passed in a blur. Becky grabbed her purse and car keys while Robert went to speak gently to Kian, explaining that Simba had gotten out and was hurt, and they needed to go help him. Kian, usually resistant to sudden changes in routine, simply nodded and stood up, his face a mask of determination. "Simba needs me," was all he said. The drive to the Hendricks property took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As they pulled up to the roadside where an elderly woman was standing watch over a still form in the grass, Becky felt her heart constrict. Simba lay motionless except for the labored rise and fall of his ribcage. His normally sleek tawny coat was matted with blood, particularly around his front paws and right hind leg, the one that had never been fully functional to begin with. Kian made a small, wounded sound as he saw his friend, but he didn't break down as his parents might have expected. Instead, he approached carefully and knelt beside Simba, speaking in a soft, even tone. "It's okay, Simba. We're going to help you. You helped me so many times. Now it's my turn." The Bobcat's eyes, usually so alert and golden, were half closed with pain, but at the sound of Kian's voice, they seemed to focus momentarily. A weak rumble, not quite a purr, but a clear acknowledgement, emanated from the injured animal. "We need to get him to Dr. Michaels right away," Robert said, already spreading out the emergency blanket they had brought from the car. With great care, he and Becky transferred Simba onto the blanket, mindful of potential spinal injuries. Kian hovered nearby, his hands fluttering with anxiety, but his voice remaining steady as he continued to reassure Simba. The local veterinary clinic was thankfully only a 15-minute drive from the accident site. Dr. Michaels, who had been Simba's primary veterinarian since his rescue, had been alerted and was waiting when they arrived. His expression as he conducted the initial examination didn't offer much hope. "Multiple fractures to both front limbs," he murmured, his gentle hands moving methodically over the sedated Bobcat. "The right hind leg has a compound fracture. That's particularly concerning given its pre-existing condition. There's also significant trauma to the paw pads and extensive lacerations across the body." He straightened up and looked at the family with compassion, but also professional honesty. "I need to be straight with you. These injuries are extremely severe. Even with the most aggressive treatment, Simba may never regain full mobility. and the recovery would be lengthy, painful, and extraordinarily expensive. Are you saying we should put him down? Becky asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Michaels sighed. I'm saying that would be the most humane option to consider. I know how special Simba is to your family, especially to Kian, but sometimes the kindest choice is the hardest one. Kian, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the examination room, suddenly stood up. At 10 years old, he was still small for his age, but in that moment, he seemed to draw himself up with unusual presence. No, he said clearly, his voice lacking its usual hesitance. Simba wouldn't give up on me. I'm not giving up on him. Dr. Michaels approached Kian, kneeling to meet the boy at eye level. Kian, I understand how much you love Simba, but his injuries are very, very serious. He would be in a lot of pain during recovery, and we can't even be sure he would recover enough to have a good quality of life. He deserves a chance, Kian insisted, tears now streaming down his face, but his voice remaining steady. Please, just a chance. Something extraordinary happened then. Simba, despite the sedation and his grievous injuries, seemed to stir on the examination table. His eyes opened, focusing hazily on Kian. With what appeared to be tremendous effort, the Bobcat attempted to move, his broken limbs scrabbling weakly as he tried to pull himself toward the edge of the table, toward Kian. Everyone in the room froze, watching in disbelief as Simba, clearly in excruciating pain, continued his desperate attempt to reach the boy. One of the veterinary nurses, Lisa, moved quickly to stabilize the animal before he could fall, but not before Simba had made his intent unmistakably clear. I've never seen anything like that, Dr. Michaels said quietly. He shouldn't even be conscious with the sedative I gave him, let alone trying to move. Lisa, who had been gently restraining Simba, looked up with tears in her eyes. Doctor, I know this isn't my place, but I have a suggestion. My sister works with Dr. Noel Carter at the Advanced Veterinary Surgical Center in Minneapolis. He specializes in orthopedic surgery for exotic animals. If anyone could help Simba, it would be him. Dr. Michaels considered this. Carter has a remarkable reputation, but his clinic is nearly 200 miles from here, and the cost would be. We'll find a way, Robert interrupted firmly. If there's even a small chance, we owe it to both Simba and Kian to try. The decision made, things moved quickly. Dr. Michaels stabilized Simba for transport, setting temporary splints and administering pain medication and fluids. Lisa made the call to her sister, who managed to secure an emergency consultation with Dr. Carter that same evening. Robert made arrangements for Kian to stay with his grandparents while he and Becky made the 3-hour drive to Minneapolis, but Kian adamantly refused. I need to be there, he insisted, showing rare determination. Simba knows when I'm scared or sick. He helps me. Maybe I can help him now. Reluctantly, his parents agreed, knowing that separating Kian from Simba at this critical juncture might be more traumatic than the difficult journey ahead. The drive to Minneapolis was tense, with Becky constantly checking on Simba in his specially prepared carrier in the back seat beside Kian. The Bobcat remained sedated but stable, his breathing shallow but regular. Kian sat perfectly still for the entire journey, his hand resting gently on the carrier, occasionally whispering reassurances that only Simba could hear. Dr. Carter's clinic was illuminated against the darkening evening sky when they arrived. Unlike the homey, rural atmosphere of Dr. Michaels' practice, the Advanced Veterinary Surgical Center was a state-of-the-art facility with equipment that rivaled many human hospitals. Dr. Carter himself, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, was waiting at the entrance. You must be the Thompsons, he greeted them. Lisa's sister called ahead with the details. Let's get your Simba inside and assessed immediately. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Simba was rushed for emergency imaging, x-rays, ultrasounds, and even a CT scan to fully evaluate the extent of his injuries. The Thompsons waited anxiously in a comfortable consultation room. Kian uncharacteristically still and focused, as if concentrating all his energy on willing Simba to be okay. When Dr. Carter finally returned, his expression was serious but not without hope. "Simba's injuries are indeed extensive," he began, spreading out several images on the table before them. Multiple fractures to both front limbs, as Dr. Michaels identified, and a particularly complex compound fracture of the right hind leg. There's also significant soft tissue damage and laceration of the paw pads. He pointed to various areas on the images as he spoke. The good news is that, somewhat miraculously, there appears to be no significant internal trauma. His spine is intact, and all major organs appear to be functioning normally. This gives us something to work with. So there's hope. Becky asked, clutching Robert's hand tightly. "There's always hope," Dr. Carter replied with a small smile. "But I want to be very clear about what we're looking at here. Treating Simba would require multiple surgeries. We'd need to reconstruct the bone in his right hind leg using pins and possibly bone grafts. Both front limbs would need surgical repair as well. The recovery would be long, possibly 6 months or more, and would require intensive physical therapy. And even then, he may never regain full function of his limbs, particularly that right hind leg. But he could still have a good life?" Robert asked. "He's always adapted well to his hind leg limitation." Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Wild bobcats need full mobility to survive, of course. But from what you've told me, Simba has already adapted to a different kind of life with your family. With proper care and accommodation for any resulting disabilities, yes, he could still have a good quality of life." "What about the cost?" Becky asked hesitantly. Wildlife rehabilitation had always been a labor of love for their family, not a source of income, and they were solidly middle class. Dr. Carter named a figure that made both parents blanch. It was more than they had in savings, more than they could reasonably afford. "I understand this is a difficult decision," Dr. Carter said gently. "You might want to take some time to discuss." "We'll do it." Kian's voice, clear and determined, cut through the momentary silence. "Simba is family. We don't leave family behind." Becky and Robert exchanged a look filled with both concern and pride. Their son, who sometimes struggled to speak up in class or order his own food at restaurants, was showing a resolve they had rarely seen. "Kian's right," Robert said finally. "We'll find a way. Maybe a payment plan, or—" "Actually," Dr. Carter interjected, "we have a foundation associated with the clinic specifically for cases like this. Extraordinary animals with extraordinary bonds to their humans. I think Simba would be an excellent candidate. It wouldn't cover everything, but it could make the difference." The path forward decided. Simba underwent his first surgery that very night, an emergency procedure to stabilize the most critical fractures and address the risk of infection from his open wounds. Dr. Carter worked for nearly 6 hours, his skilled hands navigating the delicate anatomy of the bobcat with precision and care. Simba survived the surgery, but the next 48 hours were critical. The Thompson family checked into a nearby hotel, taking shifts so that someone was always at the clinic. Kian refused to leave at all the first day, sitting quietly in the waiting area with his tablet, occasionally asking the staff for updates in his soft, careful voice. On the second day, once Simba was stable enough for brief visits, Kian was allowed to see him. The bobcat lay in a special enclosure, various tubes, and monitoring equipment attached to his body, his limbs carefully bandaged and immobilized. He looked small and vulnerable, so different from the graceful, powerful animal that had bounded through their home. Kian approached slowly, guided by one of the veterinary nurses. "Can he hear me?" he whispered. "I believe he can," the nurse replied kindly. Animals often seem to know when their loved ones are near, even when they're sedated. Kian nodded solemnly and leaned close to the mesh front of the enclosure. "Hi, Simba," he said softly. "It's me, Kian. You're going to be okay. The doctors are helping you, and I'm here. I'm not leaving you. Remember how you stay with me when I'm scared or sick? I'm going to stay with you now." To everyone's surprise, Simba's monitors showed a subtle change. His heart rate, which had been elevated, began to slow slightly toward a more normal rhythm. One of his ears twitched, as if seeking the source of Kian's voice. "Would you look at that?" the nurse murmured to Becky, who stood watching with tears in her eyes. "I'd say he definitely knows Kian is here." Over the next 2 weeks, Simba underwent 2 more surgeries. The second procedure focused on reconstructing his right hind leg, which required specialized pins and a bone graft. The third addressed his front limbs and the extensive damage to his paw pads, which required skin grafting. Between operations, he remained at the clinic under constant care, receiving physical therapy, pain management, and monitoring for complications. The Thompsons couldn't stay in Minneapolis indefinitely. Robert needed to return to his job as a forestry consultant, and Kian needed to return to school. They made the difficult 3-hour drive home, but each weekend found them making the journey back to the clinic to visit Simba. Dr. Carter and his team kept them updated daily with photos and detailed reports, and Robert set up video calls so Kian could see Simba and talk to him even from afar. To everyone's surprise, these virtual visits seemed to have a positive effect on Simba's recovery. The nurses reported that the Bobcat would become more alert and engaged when he heard Kian's voice coming from the tablet they placed near his enclosure. His vital signs improved, and he began to take more interest in his surroundings. "Animals are remarkable in their capacity to heal," Dr. Carter told them during one weekend visit, about a month after the accident. "But I've rarely seen such determination as Simba has shown. He seems to be fighting not just to survive, but to get back to your family, especially to Kian." Kian, who had been sitting quietly beside Simba's enclosure, now larger to allow the Bobcat some limited movement as his healing progressed, simply nodded as if this was obvious. "Simba knows I need him," he said matter-of-factly, "and he knows I'm waiting for him to come home." The road to recovery was not without setbacks. 6 weeks into treatment, Simba developed an infection in his right hind leg that threatened to undo much of the progress he had made. For several tense days, the veterinary team fought to bring the infection under control with powerful antibiotics and careful wound management. During this crisis, Kian insisted on an unplanned trip to the clinic, somehow convinced that Simba needed him there. "He's scared," Kian had told his parents with unusual insistence. "I can feel it. I need to tell him it's going to be okay." Whether it was the antibiotics finally taking effect, the skilled care of the veterinary team, or the comfort of Kian's presence, or perhaps some combination of all three, Simba rallied. The infection receded, and the healing process resumed its cautious progress. 3 months after the accident, Dr. Carter broached the subject of Simba's eventual return home. "He's not fully healed yet," he cautioned the family, "but he's reached a point where his recovery might actually benefit from being in familiar surroundings, provided we can arrange for continued physical therapy and monitoring." "We'll do whatever it takes," Becky assured him. "Our spare room has already been converted into a recovery space for him, with everything at ground level, so he won't need to jump or climb until he's ready. And I've been learning about physical therapy for animals," Kian added shyly. "The nurses showed me some exercises I can help with." Dr. Carter smiled at the boy's dedication. "Well, it seems like Simba will be in excellent hands. We'll need to set up regular checkups with Dr. Michaels, with video consultations from me as needed. And he'll still need one more surgery in about 2 months to remove some of the pins, but that can be scheduled once he's fully stabilized." The day Simba returned home was both joyous and nerve-wracking for the Thompson family. The Bobcat was transported in a specially designed carrier that minimized jostling during the long drive. Though he was now able to stand and take a few halting steps, he was still a far cry from the agile, powerful animal he had once been. His once thick coat was patchy from the multiple surgeries, and he had lost a significant amount of muscle mass during his long convalescence. Yet when they carried his carrier into the house and opened the door, allowing him to emerge at his own pace, there was an unmistakable sense of recognition, of homecoming. Simba sniffed the air, his golden eyes scanning the familiar environment. Then his gaze fixed on Kian, who sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, waiting patiently. With deliberate movements, favoring his still healing limbs, Simba made his way to the boy. The journey of a few feet seemed to take an eternity, each step careful and measured. When he finally reached Kian, he did something he had done countless times before. He bumped his head gently against the boy's chest, a gesture of affection and connection that spoke volumes. Kian's arms encircled the bobcat with infinite gentleness, mindful of his healing body. "Welcome home, Simba," he whispered. "I told you we'd make it." The months that followed brought steady, if slow, improvement. True to their word, the Thompsons converted their spare room into a rehabilitation space for Simba, with cushioned flooring to protect his healing limbs and a variety of therapeutic tools recommended by Dr. Carter. Kian, with a dedication that amazed his teachers and therapists, took on significant responsibility for Simba's daily physical therapy sessions, carefully guiding the bobcat through exercises designed to rebuild strength and mobility. Simba's right hind leg would never be as strong as his other limbs. The combination of his congenital condition and the severe trauma ensured that. He developed a distinctive gait, moving with a slight roll that accommodated his limitations. But true to Dr. Carter's prediction, he adapted with remarkable resilience. 6 months after the accident, Simba underwent his final surgery to remove the remaining pins from his right hind leg. Dr. Michaels performed the procedure locally, with Dr. Carter consulting via video conference. The surgery was successful, and with the removal of the hardware, Simba gained increased comfort and flexibility, though he would always bear the scars of his ordeal. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Simba's recovery was the way he resumed his protective behavior toward Kian. Despite his own limitations, he once again demonstrated that uncanny awareness of the boy's needs. When Kian had episodes of sensory overload, Simba would still sit beside him, his presence a calming influence. And incredibly, he maintained his ability to sense when Kian's breathing was becoming labored, a warning sign of potential infection due to his immunodeficiency. One night, nearly 8 months after the accident, Becky was awakened by Simba's insistent pawing at her bedroom door. This was unusual. Since his recovery, the bobcat typically slept in Kian's room. Following Simba's urgent guidance, she found Kian struggling to breathe, the early signs of a respiratory infection that could have become dangerous if left until morning. Thanks to Simba's alert, they were able to begin treatment immediately, preventing a potential hospitalization. "How does he know?" the doctor asked when Becky recounted the incident during Kian's follow-up appointment. "It's almost as if he can sense changes in Kian's body chemistry before they become symptomatic." Becky smiled. "We've stopped questioning it. Some connections just transcend explanation." The Thompson family's journey with Simba attracted attention beyond their small rural community. A local newspaper ran a feature story about the extraordinary bond between the boy and the bobcat, and their remarkable journey of mutual healing and support. The story was picked up by regional media, then national outlets fascinated by this unusual tale of interspecies connection. Dr. Carter's clinic used Simba's case, with the family's permission, as a compelling example for their foundation's fundraising efforts, helping to secure support for other animals with extraordinary needs and bonds. The publicity also brought unexpected financial support for the Thompsons, with donations helping to offset the considerable remaining medical expenses from Simba's treatment. Perhaps most meaningfully, Kian's school invited him to give a presentation about Simba and wildlife rehabilitation. For a boy who had always struggled with social interaction and public speaking, this was a daunting challenge. Yet with Simba's story as his focus, Kian found his voice. Speaking about his beloved companion gave him a confidence he had never before displayed. "Simba was hurt really badly," he told his classmates and teachers, showing photographs of the bobcat's recovery journey. The doctor said he might not make it, but I knew he would because Simba is strong and brave. He's always taken care of me when I'm scared or sick, so I needed to take care of him too. As Kian spoke, Becky and Robert watched from the back of the classroom with tears in their eyes. Their son, who had faced so many challenges, had found an extraordinary source of strength and connection in his unusual friendship with a wild animal. And that animal, through his own incredible journey of survival and recovery, had demonstrated the remarkable capacity for resilience and adaptation that exists in all living beings when supported by love and dedicated care. 1 year after the accident, the Thompson family held a small celebration to mark Simba's recovery. The bobcat, now fully adjusted to his new physical reality, moved through their home with deliberate grace. His distinctive gait and the patches in his coat where the fur had grown back differently told the story of his ordeal, but his golden eyes were as bright and alert as ever, particularly when they rested on Kian. As evening fell, Becky found Kian and Simba in their favorite spot by the living room window, watching the sunset paint the Minnesota woods in shades of gold and amber. The boy sat cross-legged on the window seat, the bobcat curled beside him, his head resting on Kian's leg. They formed a tableau of perfect companionship, two beings who had faced profound challenges and emerged stronger through their connection to each other. "Dinner's almost ready," she said softly, reluctant to disturb the peaceful scene. Kian looked up with a smile. "We're just watching the birds," he said. "Simba still likes to watch the birds, even though he can't chase them anymore. I think he's happy just being here with you," Becky replied, reaching out to gently stroke the bobcat's head. Simba leaned into her touch, a low rumble of contentment emanating from his chest. In that moment, Becky was struck by the profound gift they had all received through this difficult journey. Simba's accident and near death had been traumatic, but his extraordinary fight for survival had revealed the depths of connection possible between species. And Kian, in rising to meet the needs of his beloved companion, had discovered reservoirs of strength, determination, and communicative ability that might otherwise have remained dormant. Some might question the wisdom of the resources, financial, emotional, and physical, that the family had poured into saving one bobcat. But as Becky watched her son and Simba silhouetted against the fading light, she knew without doubt that it had been worth every sacrifice. In reaching out across the divide between human and wild animal, they had all been enriched beyond measure. "You were right all along," she told Kian softly. "You said Simba would make it, and he did." Kian nodded, his hand resting gently on Simba's back. "We take care of each other," he said simply. "That's what family does." In the gathering twilight, Simba's purr seemed to echo the sentiment, a testament to the extraordinary things made possible by compassion, dedication, and the unbreakable bonds of love that can form between the most unexpected companions.